one alarming statistic, they looked at young men that were not overweight, and they found that they did something called a insulin resistance score test on them, and they found that more than half of them had insulin resistance. And these are young men in their 20s, not overweight, normal ideal weight. So I think that kind of brings us to one of the first drivers, which is this insulin resistance concept.
Now, just to kind of back up on that, that's a stunning statistics. 50% of healthy, normal weight, 20-year-old men have prediabetes or some degree of
insulin resistance,
which is on the way to prediabetes.
Yeah, their blood sugar normal.
And are they measuring this by the new mass spec test from Quest?
Yes.
Which is a really new test. So,
right.
So just to back up on that, the way we used to measure insulin resistance in the lab was a euglycemic clamp test. Super complicated, very difficult. And we now, have a new test that is equivalent to that, that sort of surpasses the test we have been using, which are just serum insulin levels and blood sugar and A1C and a glucose tolerance test, which basically can give you a lot of information. But this new technique of measuring C-peptide, which is sort of like the initial fragment of insulin, and then insulin, using a technique called mass spectrometry through Quest, we can actually now be very, very good at predicting who has insulin resistance. And so insulin resistance seems to be the driver of fatty liver, correct?
It's the huge driver of fatty liver disease. I would say it's the number one driver, but there are 8 or 9 drivers. But so what happens is that due to inflammation, due to toxicity, due to too much sugar, like too much of a sugar overload or a carbohydrate overload, when those receptors on our fat cells, we have these insulin receptors that are supposed to take sugar and put sugar into the cells. Yeah. When they start to not work well, when they start to get resistant, there is an enzyme called hormone-sensitive lipase. Yeah. And what that enzyme does is it starts tearing up the fat in the fat cell, and it sends the fat to the liver, and it overloads the liver. So now you have this liver that gets overloaded. So the liver ends up with a whole bunch of triglycerides, which is one of the tests that we look on the lipid panel. Yeah. Now, here's the interesting thing. So you could check a triglyceride level, and their level would look okay, and that's because some people genetically will decrease triglycerides in the blood, but increase it in the liver. What the triglycerides do, when you end up sending a whole bunch of triglycerides to the liver, they turn into something called VLDL. Yeah. And they call triglyceride triglyceride-rich VLDL versus triglyceride-poor. And VLDL there's another enzyme found in the lining of our blood vessel that is called lipoprotein lipase, and it turns it into the tiny dense LDL. Which causes clogging of the blood vessel and heart disease, strokes, and heart attacks.
Okay, this is so juicy right here. I'm just going to unpack a little bit because basically, just to kind of put things in context, in France, there's a delicacy called foie gras.
Oh, yeah.
Which I probably didn't pronounce right, but foie gras, whatever. And that means, in French, fatty liver.
Yep.
Now, most people think that if you eat fat, you get fat. And that fatty liver must be coming from all the fat we eat. But what you just said was that, in fact, it's not true, that it's actually the sugar and refined starches and carbohydrates, the flour and the sugar that we're eating in pharmacologic doses that's overloading our biology and causing that carbohydrates to turn into triglycerides, which then turns into fatty liver. And then you're in this vicious cycle where the fatty liver then creates all sorts of other problems. So let's kind of unpack what happens biologically when you have a fatty liver. Okay. You get a fatty liver, and so your liver is like looking like a fat goose or duck liver, and you don't want to serve it on toast unless you're maybe Hannibal Lecter. And then you've got a process going on in that liver that's just more than the accumulation of fat. So what other things are happening in the liver that end up causing harm? You mentioned that the type of cholesterol we get because of that fatty liver is the dangerous, small, dense cholesterol we talked about in the podcast. We did a whole podcast on cardiovascular risk and lipid analysis. So the small, dense cholesterol particles, which, by the way, everybody listening, your doctor's not measuring when you go to get your cholesterol test. Less than 1% of cholesterol tests in America are for the right cholesterol test, which is called lipoprotein fractionation. And it's looking at the particle size, the particle number, the VLDL numbers. And you can get all that, by the way, through functionhealth.com//Mark. It's a company I co-founded. It's a lot of people that get access to the right amount of information and data. So functionhealth.com/Mark, you can get the right panel so you can see what's going on. And we also measure insulin, although soon we're going to be measuring this insulin resistance score, which is very exciting.
Right. Yeah. So
what's happening in the liver?
What's happening in the liver? So we can go back to what's happening in the fats and then go right back to the liver. So number one, the fat starts to send the triglycerides to the liver and start overloading the liver. When that process is overloaded, then your fat cells, which actually your fat is, I don't know if you've done a podcast on this, but your fat is like an endocrine organ. It makes things like adiponectin. When the process is bad, adiponectin levels can go down, which causes more insulin resistance and more inflammation. And then there are other hormones that can go up in the liver that can cause inflammation, like tumor necrosis factor, like leptin, so those go up, and now that inflammation and worsening insulin resistance and all that fat make its way throughout the body, and they go in the liver, and the liver starts to accumulate and accumulate and accumulate, and it just can't keep up with it. The liver packages it and sends it back to the fat. The fat takes it up, but then because of the insulin resistant, it shoots it right back to the liver, and you end up with this vicious cycle. In the meantime, the liver's not supposed to be storing fat. The liver is supposed to be making all these metabolic processes. It's supposed to repackage the fat. And now when it gets overloaded and jam-packed, now the liver starts to get inflamed. It starts to rust, oxidative stress. Sugar starts to get worse, and it kind of creates this metabolic nightmare.
It's like a vicious cycle.
It's a vicious cycle.
And what you're saying essentially is it's both an endocrine and an immune organ. So all the hormones that regulate weight, appetite, insulin resistance, like leptin, adiponectin, these are hormones that the body produces to regulate your eating behavior and your way you process sugars and regulate inflammation, like you said, tumor necrosis factor alpha or IL-6. And these are cytokines. We heard about the cytokine storm. So with the fatty liver, you're not just getting fat in there. You're getting this cytokine kind of increase that's driving systemic inflammation throughout the body, which it can explain a lot of the things we see with the increased rate of death and heart attacks and cancers and all these things that seem to be related to inflammation.
Right. And the thing is, I mean, we could probably do a whole podcast on when you have fatty liver, all of the other imbalances, or all of the other things that are thrown off in the human body. Unfortunately, too many providers, too many doctors take a look at, say, oh, you have fatty liver, lose weight, and they move on, and they don't really talk to them about it again. Yeah. When really that is driving heart disease, it's driving Alzheimer's disease, it's driving cancer. Yeah. The liver is supposed to be metabolizing our toxins. Yeah. So now now your liver's not working. It causes hormone imbalances. The liver's supposed to metabolize estrogen. So now you can't metabolize estrogen. Estrogen goes up, progesterone goes down. Women start to have
infertility issues.
Infertility is big. They start to have mood issues. They start storing more weight. And men start to have that estrogen effect. It blocks their testosterone, and it's kind of this. It affects everything. It affects everything.
So men basically lose hair on their bodies. They grow man boobs. They have low sex drive, low testosterone.
Right.
Just from having a fatty liver.
Right.